Good evening, everybody. My name is Christina, and we are here tonight with Emily Spence, and we are going to be touring a historic church site in um, Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm going to let Emily introduce herself. And this is, I think, our 6th tour of faith, if I'm correct. And I'm going to let Emily introduce herself, and then I believe we have a video that we're going to be watching as a tour of the historic church site. So go ahead, Emily. Oh, and pardon the thunder and lightning in the background.
Hi, my name is Emily Spence. I'm the Digital Education Manager here at the Old North, so I work in the Education Department, and thank you so much for having me and thinking of the Old North for your tour of faith. So I don't know if anyone's had the opportunity to visit us up in Boston. We are the oldest still standing church in Boston. We're about 300 years old. It was built in 1723, so we'll be turning 300 next year. And we're one of about 15 sites on the Freedom Trail. So these are historic sites throughout Boston that relate to Revolutionary history. And there literally is a little brick line that connects all of the different sites. So a lot of people, that's how they visit us. As they're visiting Boston, they're walking the Freedom Trail, and they come to the site. And what has made our site so famous, so well known, is our connection to the story of Paul Revere's ride, that this was the church that he used for his signal lanterns. But what really launched us into sort of national consciousness was the poem Paul Revere's Ride, written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, almost 100 years later. He visited the church in 1860, and at that point, the country was on the brink of civil war. And so he was looking for a story of someone who would, I think, galvanize the people of America to do something to try and prevent civil war. And he comes across the story of Paul Revere, and that's what inspires him to write his poem, Paul Revere's Ride. But he makes some changes to the story. He takes some poetic liberties because he's really trying to paint Paul Revere as an active citizen, as someone who is taking action in his community to make a difference. And we think that's a really important thing at Old North. We see that throughout our history with other members of our community, but it does mean that the story that sort of has been told isn't quite the real story. So in the video that we'll watch, you'll learn a little bit more about what really happened that night. And so this video is also, as I said, to talk about other active citizens in Old Norse history, some of the people who are less famous, but who played a really big role in creating the church community. I think one of the really cool things about Old North is that it has been here for 300 years, except for a couple of years during the Revolution when it was closed. It's been an active church. There's still a congregation that worships there today. And so it has a really long history to tell. It's borne witness to many phases of America's history. And so it can, not only do we interpret the story of Paul Revere and the Revolution, but we can talk about the colonial maritime industry and the tension between Anglicans and Puritans in the founding of Massachusetts. We can talk about urban slavery because we had both enslavers and enslaved people as a part of the congregation. And talk about the changing North End community, how it went from being a wealthy maritime community to a community for immigrants, first Irish and then Italian, and really the flavor of the North End today. You can see the influence from those Italian immigrants. So there's a lot of history that can be told at our site, and I think that's what makes it so exciting. So I'll stop talking now and start the video. I think what we're going to do is probably watch the first couple of sections, and we can stop. We can answer questions and offer some comments about the site and the story beyond Paul Revere.
What I'm looking forward to most is that I probably would love to go visit Boston and learn some of the history, and I've never done that. So this is cool for me because I would love to learn some of this, and so I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I know. I think again, we get to tell so much. People think of Boston, I think, as like revolutionary history, but there's so much more, and I think that's the cool thing about Old North is that it really is born witness to all of that history.
It's still being used as a church?
It's still an active church today, so there's still a congregation that.
I thought it was completely historic, and not maybe that was the other one that. Well, yeah, very cool.
Yeah. So let me. I'll make sure I do this.
Good spot to pause it because I had I was very interested for a second, like the oh man, the word is escaping me. the organ. That is a massive thing on the inside.
Yeah, it's so the organ is really spectacular. It is there's 1,756 pipes in it. So it's about a mid-sized organ.
Oh, I wish I could have. So we saw St. Matthew's organ yesterday.
Oh,
I could
really?
have written down, I think it was 2,000 something pipes,
Okay.
or 5,000, 2,000 or 5,000. I can't remember now. I should have wrote it down. But they actually climbed in that organ at one point to play it. Like they climbed up inside it,
Oh
which
my
I thought
goodness.
was very interesting.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh, this one looks very cool too. And like, it doesn't look like it's that huge, from the outside, but when you look at the inside like that.
There's a lot of pipes in behind the casing. That's where all the pipes are. So you do have to climb into it to tune all the pipes. They have some tuners come a couple of times a year to tune it. It's a really remarkable instrument. It was actually built for the space, so it's built to get sort of the optimal sound in that space, and built to play specifically like Baroque style music as well. So when the organist is playing Bach, it sounds really good in there.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then, so something else so somebody whitewashed all the walls.
Yeah, so that's the other thing too, is that when people come in, they are surprised by how just sort of simple and clean it is. But it actually, at the time, it would have been much more colorful. When the church was built, so they were the second Anglican church in Boston, and Boston was primarily Puritan. It was primarily Congregationalist, and so they would have been much more colorful, much more ornate than the Puritans, and that would have been a real sore spot with their neighbors. That they actually, when the chandeliers were put in, that was quite controversial because they lit them for Christmas, so they had these ornate lighting that they were celebrating Christmas. The Puritans were again celebrating Christmas, so it was a lot of tension between them. So it would have been much more colorful in there. But in 1912, they did a restoration of the church. And I think probably at that point, it was starting to get pretty dirty. And so I think one way to make the church look cleaner and brighter was to paint it white. Would probably seem like easier upkeep. And then also, ironically, by that point, that's when you have a lot of Irish and Italian immigrants moving into the area and building Catholic churches. And so painting the church white was a way for them now to differentiate themselves from the Catholic churches that were there.
Ah, I
It
got
all
you.
came full circle.
I guess so. Well, because I remember, I don't know if any of you have been on the call for the church we did in Mount Vernon. It was brought out that the early settlers were leaving and separating themselves from the Catholic Church, from the Church of England, and so
Yeah.
they did not want any of the iconography or the statues or the cross or the this or the that in a church. It was strictly Bible. It was strictly a place to sit and read the Bible and to study without all of the extras, because they were wanting to be separate from that. And so then I can see how it could switch over, and then there'd be all these murals and all these paintings, and that how I could see how that could create some conflict, because some of the people that were original Puritans did not want, if I'm correct, they did not want all of that ornateness. So very interesting to cover over it, but it's so interesting how now it's kind of like trying to restore some of that, because some of that is valuable artwork.
Yeah, I think it would be so cool. I think, down the road, just that angel, the little angel face that they uncovered, I think was months of work. So it's,
Sure.
a very time consuming project, but it is something we'd eventually love to do, because I think it really would show what the church originally looked like. And as TJ mentioned in the video, it was one of the early congregants. Actually, he was the stepfather of Robert Newman, the sexton who hung the lantern. John Gibbs, he was the one that painted all of that. So, it's kind of part of the history too, that it was that early congregant who was, contributing to the church with his talents.
Cheryl, I know you're on the call, and it was just reminding me for a second there, the painting over stuff is Cheryl and I took a trip to Turkey in 2014, and we learned a lot about how when different rulers came over in those areas, they would fill the, they uncovered and unearthed so much stuff so deep down in the earth, because a different ruler would come in of a different faith, and they would just cover over all the altars in sand, because that's what's in the Middle East areas, plentiful area of sand. And so every faith would just be buried on top of a faith, so it's kind of looks to me like in the Americas, we didn't have sand aplenty. So it's probably like we just paint over other faith to kind of get rid of it, you know. So it was very interesting. Does anybody have a question or a thought quick? Because we're going to go back to the video and watch some more. But I want to make sure first if anybody has anything. I know I tend to talk. All right, so if not, we have no hands raised or anything like that. We can go ahead and go back to the video, Emily. But I was glad I was thinking, oh, I had that question. Oh, I had that thought too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It X'd out. Hang on 1 second. Sorry. I think
No problem.
it escaped. It X'd out completely, but I will find the spot.
Okay, not a problem. Cheryl, did you think of that at all? I was curious. It would just kind of like sparked my mind thinking of how in the other countries, you know, the leaders took many wives of different faiths to incorporate that faith into their empire. So they would marry a wife that was of all these different faiths, and they would allow those women to build these structures and these altars of worship. And then when a new ruler came over and occupied that area, they would just cover it all up. And I was thinking, wow, that's kind of crazy how they did that.
Well, you know, Göbekli Tepe was completely covered over on purpose. Nobody understands why it was covered, but each successive build was completely covered up. No one even knew Göbekli Tepe was there before it was uncovered in, I think it was the mid-90s. So, yeah.
Göbekli Tepe is a place we saw in Turkey, just so everybody knows here. And it's older than Stonehenge.
Oh, wow.
And so it was ruins that we got to walk through that were buried in the earth in a very hot, very much desert area.
Yeah.
That I have no clue how they did all that work.
All right. I found it, so I will resume for us. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that presentation. That was so very interesting. Linda and Jennifer both said thank you. This was very great. Do you guys have anybody have any thoughts or anything they'd like to share? I will say the church event we did with Mount Vernon talked a little bit about why the pews were all in boxes. And I get that that you had to pay, like that was your pew, that you paid for some of that. But then they also said that, which made sense, and I'm sure it makes sense for back then too, is that there was no heat, no forms of heat. And so you stayed warmer in a box. And then there was those little foot warmers that were made out of like cast iron and wood that went inside. And I was like, oh my gosh, I never would have thought of that. But you know, for those of you that weren't on that, if you wanted to know like that kind of really neat makeup for it, and that you paid for it all the time as your family grew, you paid for bigger ones too. Yeah,
so our pew records are fascinating to go through. I think that's one of the other advantages of being a church is they have really incredible records. So as a historic site, you know, we can really draw upon that. But so what the families would do is they would buy the pew, and then the prices of the pews actually change over the years too. You can see that in the records, and so then the price goes down, but then you have to make like a weekly you know, obligation of a tax on the pew, plus then you were supposed to give like a contribution as well, like you know, they pass the plate around as well. So if you owned a pew, that meant you were a voting member of the church. So anytime that there was like perhaps they were picking a new minister, that if you were a pew owner, then you got to have a vote on that. But if you didn't come to church, then you didn't have to pay that like weekly contribution. So what people started to do by the mid 1800s was they would buy up pews in different churches. So they had a say in all these churches, but they weren't actually going all the time. And so, you know, the Old North at one point by the mid 1800s had really fallen on kind of hard times because they were people weren't coming and paying the weekly contributions, but they weren't also like, they wouldn't give up the pews. They were voting in certain ways that wasn't allowing other people to come in and make contributions. And it got so bad to the point where one of the ministers who wanted to start reselling the pews of people who weren't showing up, he got into a fist fight in the church with his wardens over the issue. And it became a legal battle that went all the way to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. So the pew ownership, they started to do away with that starting in 1912, but it was a very political thing as well too. Yeah.
I can imagine. All right, and Adori said, very interesting. She said, I feel like I got a bit closer to the Revolutionary War than ever before. Jennifer had a question. She said, since children were required to sit in the upper back areas, then were their mothers or eldest child typically overseeing them there as well? Or was that someone who stayed in that area and watched over the children with their mothers staying in the family boxes? Like, was there someone that stayed?
That's one of kind of the mysteries for us as well. Our sense is that probably the families did sit downstairs and the children sat upstairs. It may have been that there were servants that were up there, or you have, you know, older children keeping an eye on younger children, but it is something that baffles us today because we don't allow visitors to go up there unless it's with us on a guided tour, because it is the railings are very low. They're only about knee height and it can be kind of dangerous. So I think it kind of, it speaks to how people then sort of had different perceptions than we have today. The idea was the children were sort of out of sight, out of mind, up in the gallery. Actually, when you're down on the ground floor, you cannot see the people sitting upstairs in the gallery, which I think is also very telling that, you know, the Black congregants were forced to sit up in a way where they couldn't be seen. The poorer members of the church couldn't be seen by the wealthier members. But if you're sitting in the gallery, you can look down and see everything that's happening on the ground floor quite well. So I think it does kind of speak to a different sort of a power structure there in the church. But you raise a good point, and it's something it baffles us that, you know, what were these children doing? I will say there's a lot of graffiti up in the South Gallery where the kids would have been sitting. Some very, very entertaining graffiti. So
They were paying close attention.
They were paying very close attention.
Yeah. Does anybody have a thought or question? I just figured I'd check. I mean, Linda, I know we can see you now, and I didn't know if you had sometimes you did that. Yes. I didn't know if you were doing that because you had a question or thought. Okay. I find this crypt very interesting. That must be kind of eerie. You know what, Beatrice, I was actually going to ask this question too. I was curious of this crypt thing. She said, my apologies if anyone is offended by this question, and I'm glad you apologizing because I was curious, but she said, how do they cope with the odors of those decaying bodies? Because I can just imagine your job being the crypt keeper and having to go in there and like reorganize bodies, and like, you know, they move around in those boxes, I was like, this is kind of interesting.
Yeah. No, that's one of the reasons why the crypt was eventually closed. Was the city of Boston said that all the odors that were coming from the crypt, they were like, this just cannot be good for people's health. That it would have been, I think, miserable to be the sexton and to have to go down into the crypt and rearrange the coffins. But even in the summertime, on a hot day like today, if you were in the church, you could smell the crypt. The neighbors complain about the smell coming from the crypt.
Wow,
We
really?
actually have an account from one of the ministers, one of my favorites actually, Reverend William Croswell. He actually lived in the church. He lived in the archive room for a little while. He married the organist, who would have been right on the other side of the door. So I don't know, you can figure that one out. But he also was a poet, and he wrote a lot of poetry and just sort of musings about his time at Old North. And he does leave us with a fabulous quote about being, you know, trying to sleep in the archive room at night in the summertime. And he talks about how he is haunted by these ministries that you cannot see, but boy, can you smell them. So he said it was pretty bad up there too.
Yeah. So thanks for asking that, Beatrice, because I was almost thinking like, isn't the whole point of like being buried in the ground is like for decayment purposes? And I couldn't imagine having to move decaying bodies all the time.
I think it would have been, they would stuff the coffins with, I'm sorry, this gets kind of gross. They would stuff the coffins with cedar as a way to try and I think kind of control some of that, like to absorb anything, but I don't think it was very, very effective. Yeah.
Well, and I kind of, part of me thinks like at a funeral, like everybody goes to the grave site and they go and they lower. I've been to some funerals where they leave the coffin there and everybody that's the grave site, and then everybody leaves and you can come back a few hours later and it'll be down in the ground and buried. And I've been to somewhere they've lowered it down in the ground and everybody's thrown some dirt on it. But I'm just thinking like, did families like file in to that final resting place to like?
Yeah, I don't know if they would have witnessed the actual burial in the tomb. They may have, but I don't think they would have. They would have been coming to the crypt a lot afterwards. That's one of the things we talk about, that a lot of the tombs are unmarked. That there are very few placards or tombstones down in the crypt with people's names, because I think one, people knew where their loved ones were, but two, nobody was really going down there to see that. I think you probably would go down for the burial, but I don't think people were lingering in the crypt. They do, I think that's one of the reasons why they make that prayer space, I think, to try and create some sort of pleasant place where people could go should they want to visit a loved one, but I don't think it would have been a very, very pleasant. It would have been very dark too. It's dark now with electricity, and we have, a concrete floor down there as well. But you can imagine with no electricity, with just a dirt floor and all the decaying bodies, I think it would have been very, very unpleasant.
And very interesting that there's only so much space, yet there's 1,100, like so many barrels, because they would just let them be there for a while, maybe, who knows, maybe like 20 years. And then, all right, time to move you and put you in this common grave with everybody else that's consecrated or whatever, and move somebody else in. Very interesting thought behind all that. And I guess now there's cremated remains that are in the walls.
Yes, and so actually this wasn't on purpose, but when they went to build the columbarium in 1990, they discovered that beneath that, where they were planning to build it, was actually where the charnel pit was, where the bodies that had been removed from the tombs and then reinterred. So it's actually beneath the columbarium. So there's kind of this, I think, sort of like poetry to it, that there's the columbarium is sort of the modern crypt that's still serving the similar purpose that the historic crypt did, that it helps to support the church, but it's also a way that people can be buried somewhere that's meaningful for them too. So it's still an active grave site as well.
So she asked again, she said, why bury indoors? And there's probably lots of land around the church. One of the things I will mention is in the St. Matthew's Church we saw yesterday, they have a crypt in there as well for they have like 8, that's like a mausoleum kind of thing, and they have like 3 of them are occupied, or 4, and there's like 8 in total, and they have like the cardinals in there, or the people that have been in charge of the worship, so they have them buried, interred in there as well. So, but I mean, maybe you have a good answer too for why there's probably why.
Yeah, there's a few different reasons. So when they bought the land for the church, so Old North was built in the middle of a field, but they were sold just enough land for the outline of the church. They didn't own any of the surrounding fields, so they didn't have space for what they would have called a churchyard or a cemetery. And as I think they talked about in the video, that for the Anglicans, it was part of their faith to bury on ground that was consecrated. Now, just up the hill from us is Copp's Hill Burial Ground. So people sometimes ask, well, would they have just buried there? And perhaps some of them would have, but a burial ground actually belonged to the Puritans. It was government owned, because for the Puritans, they didn't believe on burying on consecrated ground. So though there are, when you walk around Boston, you'll see there's a lot of cemeteries. There are actually burial grounds belonging to those Puritan communities, and would have been less appealing for the people of Old North. So they're looking for somewhere that they can bury that's, sacred, and it doesn't get much more sacred than beneath your church. And I think it would have been a pretty common practice for Anglicans, probably for that reason. And again, it's another way to support the church as well, that the money from the burials would have helped pay for the upkeep of the building and the salaries of the minister and the sexton. And then it's a way that people can be buried somewhere that's also like meaningful for them too.
I enjoyed that your sexton in the video looks like a normal person. I will just say.
He's
Kinda cool.
actually he's no longer our sexton. The video that was made a couple of years ago. And we actually just this April found a new sexton. And she's our first woman sexton in 300 years.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
she's awesome. As is Tim too, but she was quite the news story. She can fix anything. She fixed it. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody have any comments or thoughts I'd like to share? Because I know it's about 6:05, and I wanted to just make sure.
If I can just plug a couple things that we're doing,
Yes.
if you don't mind, that
Yes.
if you enjoyed
Go
this,
ahead.
we do have we have digital events as well. We actually have one coming up at the end of December with TJ from the video, who's going to be doing a program called Old North and the Sea, which he talks about Old North's connection to the maritime industry. And then we're also going to be starting a new video series on YouTube with our new research fellow, Dr. Jamie Crumley. She's going to be digging into the archives to uncover more stories about our Black congregants, which has been largely left out of the narrative thus far. And her specialty is kind of looking at documents and reinterpreting them or interpreting them in a different way to look for stories that have been hidden. So it may be, somebody's probate record, their will, and she'll read the will of this person and kind of read between the lines and say, okay, but whose stories are maybe kind of hidden amongst these items. And so this video series is going to be her taking us through some of the cool documents that she finds and showing us kind of her method for interpreting them and drawing research from them. So those are two kind of things that we have upcoming if you enjoy this.
Yeah, very cool. If you have emails on that, let me know, because then I'll share.
Yeah, I can drop the Old North and the Sea event link in the chat.
All right. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Well, Dory was asking if there's an active congregation now, and I remember before you said yes, there was.
Yes.
But do they still have to pay for their box seats?
They don't. So now it's open seating. It's first come, first serve. But it is active. I'm sitting in the office of the minister here because he's on vacation. So
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yes, this is very neat. I'm gonna have to look into some other stuff to do online. Like I was just thinking while I was doing this, you mentioned the Freedom Trail, and I was thinking you should probably do like a month of some other stuff, because our tour of faiths gets very popular. That people really enjoy all of these presentations, and I'm thinking I need to figure out what I can expand to do like another month of maybe like something else around another topic.
Yeah.
So just for everybody that's on here, let me just let you guys know, we certainly enjoyed this North Church and Historic Site in Boston. Friday, the 15th at 7, we'll be learning about a trip that a husband and wife couple made from the Baha'i faith, that they made over to Jerusalem, I believe. Oh, Israel. Their pilgrimage to Haifa, Israel. So that is Friday night at 7, and they're going to take us through. She took hundreds of pictures, but they're going to take us through Mount Carmel, the Baha'i Gardens, all the different things over in that area. That is the last event for this week, and we'll just stop there because Monday is when our new email goes out for next week's events. So just so everybody knows and is aware. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and stop.